Hello, and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson from the Lohman Abdo Law Firm. We've been on a little bit of a hiatus for the summer, but we're back here taping, and we're into political season now that we've had our spring recall election, and we're coming up on primaries and then the November general. Our guest today is one of our more frequent Western Wisconsin Journal guests, and that is Dean Knudson. Dean, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
Dean, as most viewers know, is our representative from the 30th Assembly District and has been for the last 2 years. You were here, I don't know, back when you were mayor.
Yes.
May have even been before you were mayor, but let's talk about a little bit about your background. You came to this community as a veterinarian.
Yeah.
And why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your family?
So I'm a small animal veterinarian. Came to Hudson in 1989. My wife Joy and I started veterinary practice here. We raised our family here, got 2 children now that are both in college. My daughter's in graduate school, and my son's be starting his 3rd year down at UW-Madison. And so we've been very involved in the community, and I've had a number of leadership positions in Hudson in our nonprofits and things like volunteering for the FIPS and the Booster Club and youth athletics, variety of them.
Don't forget Rotary. We're in the same Rotary Club.
Yeah, I've been a Rotary member for 20 years and served in a lot of roles there, including president of the Daybreak Club here in Hudson. I was very active in the Chamber of Commerce, and I served as president of the Chamber of Commerce and a number of things. And at some point, 1996, got the idea that I should run for city council. Served 3 terms on the city council, and then I felt like that was enough. But we did some good things during that time. Kept taxes in Hudson about as low as anywhere in the state. Got some experience balancing budgets and working with constituents, and that's really pretty valuable. I think it's
so that was from 96?
That's a learned skill.
That was 96 to 2002 then?
Yes.
And
then they're 2-year terms, and there were 3 of them, so it must have been that sounds right. And then we went back to just being a private citizen. And I was encouraged to run for mayor when Mayor Breaux decided not to run after 14 years. There was an open seat, and so then I was elected twice to mayor. We did some good things. Hudson's a great community. We're really fortunate. You know, we've got great quality of life. We've got beautiful parks. While I was mayor, we, again, kept the budget balanced, we reduced spending, did some pretty innovative things. We worked on employee benefits and the cost of those benefits quite a bit. We instituted an HSA plan, for example, that saved the city about $500,000 a year on health insurance for our city employees. And Kitty Rose decided not to run, so there was an open seat for the state assembly. I was encouraged to run for state representative, and I did 2 years ago. I was elected. And I felt like I had a lot to offer, to go to Madison, to bring some of what I had learned in local government down to Madison and bring my philosophy of fiscal conservatism, standing up for the taxpayer, and still maintaining quality services by being willing to make tough choices and really approach budgeting as if it's an exercise in priorities. Got down to Madison. I had some ideas. And before I know it, we got into some pretty significant government reform in Madison in a way that we hadn't seen. We were facing tremendous challenges.
That's one way to put it. And let's talk about that a little bit, because you were, again, not shy about running as the Republican agenda. And then when Scott Walker was elected and we had a Republican majority in the Senate and the House, it was pretty much no excuse for him not to be able to put through things that he wanted to try and put through. But obviously, anytime you do things, special interests come involved, and What was that like down in Madison in March of 2010?
I'd go back to February.
March of 2011, because you were elected in November of 2010.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if you go to January, we had one of the largest incoming classes of newly elected representatives and senators in the history of the state.
That's true.
We had over 25 out of the 99 of us in the House, so fully a quarter were brand new. And we had new ideas, and we were frankly a little bit different in that we were pretty fearless about what will it mean if you do something that hasn't been done before and it affects your political future. Because very many of us, and I'd put myself in that category, were more willing to do what needed to be done for the next generation and less worried about what our decisions will mean for the next election. And too often politicians become worried about their career and what's going to happen in the next election. And then they're too afraid to do what really needs to be done. Easiest thing you can ever do is make a promise or start a program or make a commitment to someone, but not provide the means to pay for that or to push off to the future how it will be paid for. And that had been done in Madison over and over and over by both parties.
In Washington as well.
In Washington, it's going on all the time. I mean, the fact that in Wisconsin we decided to just say, no, we won't do that anymore. We're gonna approach our massive budget deficit without raising taxes, without accounting gimmicks. We're going to not only balance this budget, but also do away with our structural deficit, which was where every year we'd come in, and by this time of year there'd be this monster deficit again, and we'd all be talking about what's going to happen next year because there's a deficit. And that had been happening for decades.
Let me ask you, because you said not only this budget, because when you were taking us back in time, and we're kind of in January is where you are sworn in, and that first session starts. February is where this concept came up about restructuring the collective bargaining for public sector and maybe restructuring how those benefits are paid, whether it's the retirement.
Well, February is when the governor's proposal for this became public. I mean, this is something that we talked about a lot. I mean, I talked about it in December. I put out a 10-point plan about how I thought we should balance the budget in December of 2010. I had town hall listening sessions, and I talked about things there about what I thought we needed to do. In January, I went down to Madison, and the very first week, while we were still having orientation for the new people, we began talking about a variety of structural changes that needed to be made, and one of them had to do with benefits systems for health insurance and retirement plan and so on. And so that, when the governor came out with his plan, I mean, that was something that we'd been discussing already for weeks. I mean, I'd been involved in discussions for weeks. And so February 10th, when he announced what came to be known as Act 10, I mean, that was the beginning for a lot of people, but it was part of a continuation of a process. We knew that there was no way to solve the problem we had without either massive layoffs and cuts in services on the one hand, or some sort of a major structural reform to the way we provide those services on the other.
So you saw that,
do that.
Right. So you saw the major structural reform as necessary in order to save jobs.
Absolutely. And I think you've seen a number of communities where they've shown that to be the case. For example, in Milwaukee, they chose not to do the reforms. In Racine, they chose not to do the reforms. In Janesville, they chose not to. It was a case by case. All they had to do to get out from under doing having any of the benefits of Act 10 for their budgets was simply extend their old contracts. And you saw a race in some communities to do that. They then later had to have layoffs, because without Act 10, there would have been layoffs. And so, we saw the evidence. It's not
Although
speculation.
the districts back here in your district, the school districts in your district, did take advantage of those.
Well, for the most part, and understand budgets were going to be tight. They have been tight. State aid has been under pressure and has been generally trending downward for a number of years. 2/3 of the districts in the state of Wisconsin have declining enrollment and have for a long time and probably will for a long time. And those are the kind of the demographic trends in Wisconsin. And so school districts have now and have had very tight budgets. They're under tremendous pressure. What we're asking them to do was, and would have been asking them to do, is to have much less support from the state and no way to make up for it. With this, they had a way to make changes to help balance their budget. In some cases, it made up all of their loss in funding. In some cases, not all of it, varied district by district. But in our district, for example, the Hudson School District saved $1 million just by one simple change that they couldn't do before, which was going out to bid for the health insurance. And they couldn't do it because that couldn't be achieved through collective bargaining.
Okay, now, as I understand it, firefighters and policemen were exempted from this change, correct?
Well, Act 10 was done originally, as part of a budget repair bill. And then as we did the entire budget, would have been Act 36, the 2-year biennial budget.
Which started when?
It starts July 1st and runs through, so we're a year and a little bit into it right now.
So it was July 1 of 2011.
Yeah.
And that's what the purpose of, you have to set the tone for the next budget, but this budget repair, there's a little bit of controversy there, as far as whether it was really necessary.
Sure.
And I think part of that stemmed from perspective as to how you look at that debt to Minnesota, because we owed them some funds because of the reciprocity between the states, correct? And it was whether that gets paid in the old budget or the current budget as of January, February of 2011, or whether we push it off into the next.
Well, that's true, and in our area that's a pretty big issue because everybody wants to see income tax reciprocity restored. I wish I could promise you right now that it'll happen by October, because that's when it needs to be done and agreed in order to be in place for the following tax year for 2013 when you're filing taxes next spring. We've got to get that done. That's a top priority. Our Department of Revenue and Minnesota's Department of Revenue have been authorized by our respective governors and legislatures to just get it done. And it isn't done yet.
What needs to be done? I don't understand that. If both legislatures have basically ordered it to be done, then why isn't it done?
Well, it's a little complicated, but in essence, the original thing that made the agreement fall apart was there was a timing issue on payments. So, if Wisconsin has residents that work in Minnesota and Minnesotans work in Wisconsin, and there's some going back and forth, but there's always more on one side. There's more that are working over there or more that are working over here, and it'll always be that way. It'll never be completely equal. So somebody owes the other one some money under a reciprocity system. And there was a timing issue of when the payments happened. Governor Plenty wanted them to happen sooner. Governor Doyle kind of liked to have that money and didn't have any spare money laying around in order to pay it earlier. So it's sort of like if you'd been paying your property tax bill every single year in January and all of a sudden somebody said, hey, can you pay that in October next time? And you said, yeah, I could, but I don't have the money, and so no, I can't do that. Well, that's where we were. So it was $50 million. Minnesota ended the agreement. From that point, some interesting things happened. You'd think we could just put it back, but Minnesota actually started to collect more tax from their own people than they did before, because some of those people were getting some advantage through the old system. And so the first hurdle in negotiating was they wanted us to just put everything back and give them their money. We did that. We made that payment.
So now we're square.
Yes, we are. And as soon as we met all of their requests, guess what they did? They came up with more requests. So now they want us to make them whole for tax payments that they aren't getting and won't get if there's reciprocity, but they are getting right now, I should say. And that's something that never happened before in the 30 years of the agreement. So they're trying to kind of sweeten it up for Minnesota.
They want us to pay a little bit more than our share.
They do.
Okay.
They do. So it's become more than just that. And the other thing is there's what's called a tax incidence study. And if you filled out your own taxes this year, for example, if you use something like TurboTax, at some point there's some questions in there about, do you work in Minnesota, do you work in Wisconsin, so on and vice versa. They want to do a tax incidence study, and they'd like it to go for 2 years. 2 more years. Well, we feel like, hey, it's way past urgent for this to happen. We know the information, and anything that needs to be adjusted, we can adjust later. Let's just get the thing back in place. Because it's a tremendous burden. There's a burden on, for example, any private individual has employment income, W-2 income, but it's worse for businesses. If you have a lawn mowing business and you mow some lawns in Wisconsin and some in Minnesota, you have to actually keep track of your income and expenses, both places, so that you can file separate individual returns. And it didn't used to be that way. And there's no real reason that it should be. And that's a very simple business. You can see how a more complex business, it's a tremendous headache. So we got to get that done.
Now, it's July, very late July. It's almost August now, and you need it in place by October of 2012 for it to be for the tax year of 2013.
Time is slipping away. It's urgent. We had a meeting over at the Minnesota Capitol, and we met with our colleagues and counterparts over there, and frankly, I think it went pretty well. There's a lot of cooperation. There's a lot of agreement that we need to put this back. That was back in the spring. And, we said, look, you've got to do everything you can to get it done by October. I can't promise it will be. It's really out of my hands. There's nothing we can do as far as legislation. We are in between budgets. If it comes down that it doesn't happen and they absolutely will not budge from requiring us to pay more, then we're going to have to go back to our budget process next time. And everyone else in the state of Wisconsin who doesn't live near a border or work in Minnesota, and ask them to pay so that Minnesota has lower taxes, which is something
not likely to pass.
That's a lot more difficult than just putting it back the way it was.
It sure is. But I appreciate you explaining that, Dean, because we have a lot of viewers out there that are very close and are working in Minnesota. This affects them. It is a huge issue. But
when I was running 2 years ago, there were a couple of issues. I knocked on doors and I listened to people. There was a couple of issues I hear over and over again. One was income tax reciprocity. The other was the Stillwater Bridge. So I'm proud to say that in the 2 years, my first term, we got the Stillwater Bridge agreement. It's in place. They're out in the river right now beginning to work on it. That's actually going to finally happen. I hope that it doesn't take us as long to get that reciprocity back.
Yeah, as it did with the bridge, right?
But it's taken a while, and it's slower, and it's partly because Minnesota has a different time frame. We need to work with them and respect them where they're coming from, and they really want to have studied it before we do it. We'd rather sort of do it and study it later, and we've got to come together on that.
Well, speaking of coming together, I mean, we've got a tough task down in Madison because I asked you before what it was like in March, and you wanted to go back a little bit before that, and I appreciate that there was a lot of foundation there that set this up. That there's still a lot of hard feelings in the state. Obviously, it was hard enough feelings that they wanted to recall Governor Walker, and by the time they got around to getting a ballot on it, which was some 15, 16 months after Act 10 was announced, I think a lot of the steam and acrimony had kind of died down, except for those who this affects. And clearly it's a minority of the people in the state. We don't have a majority of people on the public sector employment that this affected. And it didn't affect all public sector employees. The firefighters and police are not involved. I asked that question before.
We got off track a little bit on that. Originally it didn't. When we went in the actual budget, there was some language in the budget in regard to police and firefighters that changed that. And what it did was, we had recognized by that point, after looking at this, that for small communities, it wouldn't work to force them into having two separate health plans with two separate designs and maybe different deductibles and everything, because usually you get your best price if you can be in one plan with as many people in it as possible. So we went back and we changed for police and fire to say that, you know, you can still bargain over not just pay, like you can now for teachers, but also for work conditions. But there's no bargaining over the details of your health insurance plan. And that's pretty significant because almost immediately that led to, for example, the city of Milwaukee going to the police and the firemen and firefighters and saying, you know, look, we're going to have you pay more for your health insurance than you used to. And so they're in a way, it's closer. They're closer than they originally were already for police and fire.
By closer, meaning closer to what the public sector, private sector has been doing as far as paying for employees paying their share of retirement and health care.
Exactly. But you know, so when it comes to strictly fiscal issues, where you could say there's pay and what will your raise be, there's health insurance and how much will you contribute towards it, there's retirement and how much will you contribute towards it. If those were the big fiscal issues in an employee-employer relationship, after what happened in the budget, on all those things, police and fire are really pretty close to what teachers are. It's not identical, but it's pretty close. But they're still able to bargain over work conditions. So that means shifts and hours and, you know, safety gear and things. It's a different job, and that was the whole idea originally, is that, you know, they wanted to be able to have the ability to bargain over those kinds of things with the idea that, hey, a policeman's in a different kind of a risk situation than a teacher is. And so they still have those rights, and then they will under our bargaining laws. But for the money issues, it's very close to how it is for the other public employees now.
Okay. And again,
and frankly, it's working pretty well. And I think that's what happened. And you mentioned, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there were unhappy people in Wisconsin. Yes, there were. But there's a lot of happy people in Wisconsin that realize that we finally did something rather than just push the problem off. We re-empowered our school boards and our city councils to actually make a decision for what's best for their community and then stand for a re-election again on the decision they made. And you're going to see that from one end of the state to the other, that school board elections are now going to be very important. Because if they're going to have the ability to make all kinds of decisions, from performance pay for teachers, which is going to become the norm in the state. Because remember, Act 10 allows bargaining over base wage. Essentially, the bargain will go pretty quickly, because in most cases, it's going to be a cost of living increase up to CPI, and then that'll be over. But the school board's going to decide on incentive pay, bonus pay, performance pay, all those kinds of things were always left out. They weren't done in Wisconsin because they were against the law in Wisconsin. It wasn't just bargaining. We actually had a law in Wisconsin, unlike Minnesota and many other states. We had a law that said you really can't do incentive pay for teachers.
Okay. And I think people that are not teachers, and especially parents of kids who are going to school, like to hear teachers being paid for performance. But how is that measured?
Quality.
How is that measured?
Well, and that's yet to come. The other thing is, because we had a system in Wisconsin where measuring the performance of teachers really had very little application, many school districts, most, had a sort of a perfunctory system of evaluating teachers. I sat on the education committee when we heard testimony, and we asked teachers about this, and you know, it wasn't uncommon. For example, one testified that, well, every 3 years they send us a self-evaluation form. We fill it out and send it back. That's what the evaluation consists of, because frankly, once you get past your first couple of years when you're on a sort of semi-probation, the evaluation doesn't count for very much anyway. And now that won't be the case. So now it's going to be on 50% on how well you do best practices, best practices teaching, so we're going to have qualified teachers and administrators who look at how the best ways to educate students are, and they're going to evaluate a teacher against that set of standards to see how they're doing. That's about half of it. The other half is going to be based on other things that individual school boards will come up with. Not more than half of it will be on learning by the students. So educational attainment of students, where you're going to measure a baseline and then how much they grow. So it's,
You're not going to have the students deciding whether the teachers get raises like ratemyprofessor.com or something.
Well, but I'll tell you what, and I think you're being frivolous, because for a second grader you wouldn't do it that way, but by the time you're in 11th grade, you ask your typical high school student, hey, you got any really good teachers you feel like really are passionate about it, they're good at it, you can watch them every day in class and kids are learning and they're changing lives, and they'll say, yeah, I'll name you some. And you ask them the same time, well, do you have any teachers that you really think aren't putting in any effort, that really aren't that good at it, and so on. And I'll bet you if you blindly asked in Hudson High, where there's a class of 400, if you blindly asked that, I bet you'd consistently over and over again get the same answers. The same handful would probably be in there. But we have had in anywhere in private industry or the rest of the world, that would happen as well. Because no matter what you're doing, some people are really, really talented and gifted and hardworking and motivated, and that's just the way it is. We're going to have a system now where a school board can set up to try to retain those teachers, reward those teachers, and incentivize others to do the same thing. And we haven't had that in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And we need to. Frankly, President Obama back in early 2010 or late 2009, President Obama and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan came to Wisconsin and said, you need to have performance pay in Wisconsin. And frankly, the teachers union was so dead set against it that we made no progress toward that. Now, they aren't Republicans, as you might know.
Yeah.
Neither one of them. But they believe in this kind of a system because they care what's best for kids. And I think a lot of people realize that you need to have excellence, you need to strive for that, there needs to be accountability. We're also going to start grading and measuring administrators, same way, mandated by state law. School board gets to decide how, but it's not optional whether you do it or not. That's another thing we haven't had in many cases. And we're going to grade schools. We didn't pass this through legislation because DPI was working on a waiver of the No Child Left Behind law, but there will be a system where there's 5 grades that a school can get, and again, there's going to be objective criteria developed by the DPI that takes the local school board and administration largely out of it. And through independent means, we're going to look at schools and say, here's a really good school, here's a school that needs some help. No Child Left Behind was originally intended to do this. As you know, that law has been largely a failure. It brought a lot of money to the table. It was the largest increase in federal funding to education ever seen, and it was also supposed to bring accountability. Largely hasn't happened. But
it brought a lot of standard testing, though.
It brought a lot of testing. And the states were allowed to set their own test. They were allowed to set their own cut scores, or what's doing good enough on the test or well enough on the test was set by the individual states. And there was a lot of incentive for them to dumb down the tests and exempt certain people from even taking the test and so on, because you had this unrealistic objection that every student was going to become proficient eventually. Well, that's a prescription for ultimately, having either every school is going to fail or every school is going to set the bar low enough that everyone can reach it, and we don't really want that. We have to compete against other countries.
Exactly. But don't you, when you set everything based on a standard test, then isn't there a danger that then the teachers begin to teach for just the test as opposed to the basic skills it's supposed to generally measure?
Sure, and that's the concern. There's more to education than a standardized test. Everyone would agree that. But there also are some core set of skills and proficiencies that you ought to have and that can be tested for. And we need to get there. Frankly, I mean, the rest of the world does this. And we've fallen behind in many cases in math and science and so on. We are not a leader in the world, and yet we need to compete against those countries.
Well, we've dealt a lot with
Well,
the
education
K
is
through 12
important. I mean, we
education.
start talking money, Jamie, and we talked about the budget and money, and we start talking about education. Education's the single biggest thing that we spend money on in Wisconsin. It was before Act 10. It is after Act 10. Nothing has changed. It's our biggest priority.
Now, I heard from somebody that that's
spending.
not true, that Department of Corrections is now bigger than our K
Not
through
even
12.
close. Not even close.
So how would it rank between corrections, K through 12, and then higher education, our state college and technical?
Sure. Not too many years ago, we were spending over 50% of our state dollars on education. Now we're at 44%. The higher education is a relatively small part of that. And we spend around 10 times as much on K-12 every year as we do on either corrections or higher ed. It's not even close. We're talking I can't summon up the exact number right
Okay.
now.
Right.
If I did, I'd be wrong. But let me just say we're talking an order of magnitude difference. It's not even close. You know what I mean by that? I mean, it's on
Yes.
the range of 10 times as much for K-12 as it is for those.
Okay.
I used to tell people this during the whole thing, and they'd say, well, you got to cut somewhere else. You can't cut education. You can't balance a $3.6 billion budget without going after where the big spending is.
Isn't that the similar thing on the federal level with what they
It
have with
is.
defense and Social Security and so forth?
Right.
If you take those off the table, how else are you going to, you can't do it.
Well, entitlement spending is where it's at the federal budget. I mean, we
Right.
will have to deal with that.
What's our equivalent, though, here at the state level? Are you
Okay,
saying that?
Medicaid. Here's what really happened, Jamie. I mean,
And there's the segue I was looking for to get to the Medicaid and talking
Yeah.
about how Obamacare and this recent Supreme Court ruling is going to affect us here in Wisconsin.
Okay. But first, let me go back before I answer that one. Because,
Okay.
you know, like any good politician, I can redirect you a little.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so what happened back in January and February and March? Everyone knows what happened in Wisconsin. A law was proposed, it was voted on, there was a lot of protesting, and the state was in turmoil for months, right? So that's what happened. But the why of it is something that a lot of people still don't really understand. We had a big budget deficit. Why? We have a very generous Medicaid program, and in order to keep that going, we needed to find $1.5 billion of new money, just this one budget, just to keep our Medicaid
And again,
programs
keeping our
going.
budget, so when you say this one budget, you're talking about the one that was expiring, the 10-11 budget, or the 11? Or
This
the,
one we're in right now.
okay, the 11-12.
Just to keep it going.
Okay, 11 to 13 is, yeah.
Just
okay.
to keep it going. So that's new money. Where did that money come from? Some of it came from less state aid to education. And so that money went to Medicaid. The money that didn't go to local schools, every single last dollar of that went into Medicaid programs. It all went to Medicaid.
And there still were short.
Well, I mean, it's difficult because that's all based on projections. We're largely balanced. Are we short? Are we long? Yeah, we're somewhere close. We're in the neighborhood. I mean, when you start talking, you're short by 0.2% or 0.5% or 1%. You could be short, but it depends on how many claims come.
Right, and
And
let's
you
talk
don't-
about
you know,
why
so-
that would be, because you said that you entered that 11 to 13, July 11 to June 2013 budget short by 1.5 billion for the Medicaid.
To make it work for the next time. We were
I know.
also short for the last time, but that was another thing. That was the budget repair bill part.
Right, but that was only 150
That
million.
wasn't very much.
Right. But this 1.5 billion, and the reason that you go into it that short is because we had that many more people in
That's
Medicare.
part of it.
Because
That's-
isn't it a function of the economy and the fact the lack of jobs? that
That's
people-
part of it. It was partly also one-time federal stimulus money. Okay,
That was there, and then it was gone.
and it was a one-time deal.
Okay.
And so that's real nice if you get it, but you're not going to get it. And, you know, the reason there was a difference between Doyle's budget projections and Walker's budget projections was Doyle was incorporating the unfounded assumption that the federal money was going to come again. No one thought it was. It could have. Congress could have miraculously said, we'll just do that over again, but there was no support for that in Congress. There was no support for that among the American people, and there was no realistic chance that that was going to happen again. So that was not what you would call fiscally sound budget projecting.
Okay.
So that was where some of that difference comes from. But so you got the loss of one-time funds. Yes, the economy leads to more people applying for Badger Care and Medicaid and all the programs involved there. And so as more people are eligible, more apply, claims come in, and so you've got that. And then at the same time, our sales tax and income tax revenues were down for the first time in history since we had both those taxes. They had never both gone down before, and they did. So that's a severe recession. I mean, before this, when we had a bad spell, tough economy, we would project 4% growth, and we'd see 3 or 2, and that's bad. Well, here we actually had a period when we had projected growth, and we didn't see growth, we saw decrease.
Right.
And that's tough. That leaves you in a pickle.
Okay,
so there's Medicaid. Medicaid is the why of what happened with Act 10. We were committed to take care of those most in need and to maintain those programs and make some tweaks to make them sustainable as we go forward, but to keep them going. We were willing to cut elsewhere to maintain priorities, and essentially you could say we prioritize Medicaid over education. Now you might say, how could you do that? Education is got to be number one. Well, I tell you what, there's a lot of people that were depending on those Medicaid programs, and it's pretty hard not to have them. That's one thing. The other thing is we didn't have the ability not to do it, because they're federal, state, cooperative programs. You have to get permission from the feds. There's no permission to change them. So you're locked in. So in the short term, we had to do it. And, that's Medicaid. Now, as we go forward, we've still got a challenge there. And we're still trying to figure out how to make all those programs sustainable. When Medicaid first went in, and if you went back to, say, the Tommy Thompson years, which, Medicaid had been in place since the 60s, and Tommy was there in the 90s, 8% of Wisconsin's population was on Medicaid pretty much through that whole period, for a 20-year period, roughly 8%. During the Doyle years, it climbed the first term, climbed second term. At the end of the second term, we were up to 21% on Medicaid. And that's where we were coming into this budget. Today, we're at like 20.5%. We've made some changes. There's not quite
so
as
1
many
out of
people.
5 of all Wisconsin residents are on Badger Care.
Over 1 million are on one of the Medicaid programs, right? And it's not just Badger Care. I mean, that encompasses family care, senior care. We've got a lot of different programs.
Okay, so now then Obama's health care plan gets passed, and then as a result of that passing, then there's backlash, and now we've got a Republican majority in Congress that has voted 12 times or 10 or 12 times to try and repeal it. Of course, it gets blocked in the Senate, and we'll have to see what happens in November to see if it's going to continue. But the one thing that the Supreme Court did in saying that we're going to uphold it and basically find that under the taxing power of the federal government, but we're not going to allow you to dictate to the states that they have to be in this program, and we're going to allow states to opt out. Is Wisconsin going to opt out?
Well, what they said was we can't mandate you to expand your number of people on Medicaid. So you got to understand, this is a national, one-size-fits-all national solution for a problem that, frankly, in Wisconsin, we were already doing better than, in many ways, in many cases, we were already doing better.
Which we are in lots of areas.
In lots of areas.
Not just healthcare.
So here's a nutshell thing of the differences for Wisconsin. Basic Medicaid, it started, there's a federal poverty line, and we use the term 100% of the poverty level. So if you have a family of 4, it's around $30,000 income. Okay, so basic Medicaid, as it exists in every state, it means that if you're below that 100% level, you're covered. Well, there began a movement to expand Medicaid a number of years ago, and some states went to 133%. So they're being more generous. They're letting people that have a higher family income be eligible for Medicaid. And some states went to 150%, some went to 200%. In Wisconsin, we went up to 300% for some people. And we went to 200% for lots of others. And so that's where we were. We were a little higher than Minnesota. We're among the most generous states there were. And so we ended up, there's only about 3 states that have as low number of uninsured as we have in Wisconsin today, before Obamacare. And we're in probably the top 4 for coverage.
And you said 200%, so a family of 4 could make $60,000 and still qualify for some Badger Care or Medicaid.
Forms of Badger Care, and there's a sliding scale to pay premiums on, and the federal poverty level varies and so on and so on. But you've got the concept there.
Right.
But there are groups that are not eligible, and one of them is childless adults. So they've never been covered under any Medicaid plans, really, and so that's where the crux is. And a lot of those people are the uninsured then. Those are the group that you're talking about that are intentionally uninsured in some cases. But in Wisconsin, unless you were in one of those groups or you had enough income probably that you could afford to buy your own health insurance, then, we really aren't moving forward. And in fact, what happens with Obamacare is everybody goes to 133%. So now we're going backwards in Wisconsin. We're covering fewer people than we've been covering because that's the way the system works. And then what Obamacare envisions is that for those people that are above that line, that they're going to go into an exchange.
The exchange pool, yeah.
The exchange pool, and in the exchange, there will be a subsidy that comes from the federal government. And the federal government will get the money for that subsidy from taxpayers, you and I and all of your listeners, and also now everybody who doesn't choose to get health insurance will pay a tax in there. And from those taxpayers, they're going to subsidize the health insurance of all the people that we're currently in Wisconsin. Many of them, they've already got coverage. So we're going to take.
So our budget should go down then in Wisconsin. So because we don't have to provide it to 200%.
No one knows what will happen. Frankly, I mean there was a actuarial and accounting study done. It was commissioned back during the Doyle years. The thing came out, and frankly, it was pretty controversial. It came out about a year ago now, and it showed that there's some possibility that. In Wisconsin, we may have fewer people covered than we have right now. That's a possibility. And in other words, some people are going to choose not to do the new plan. They're going to pay the penalty, but they're not going to have insurance. And they're going to wait. Well, this is exactly what we don't want to have happen. We don't want people waiting until they're really sick and then going to the emergency room, but there's a definite possibility that we're going to have more people doing that than are doing it right now in Wisconsin. It's not necessarily an easy slam dunk thing that it's good for Wisconsin. And so, these exchanges, you could either do it early, you could do it at the end by the deadline, or you could not do it at all. And we haven't done it early. There's a handful of states that have.
Right.
They've spent millions of dollars to set up their exchanges. And if that law gets changed, or repealed, then that will have been money sunk that they could have used in a classroom.
So it's a wait-and-see approach, I guess.
So it's a wait-and-see approach, and it's not as simple as here's good and here's bad.
Well, the date that the full, and I forget the Affordable Health Care Act, that's the official name of the Obama's health care plan.
Well, the full name is Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act. We call it PPACA.
Okay.
But since even the acronym is too long, people call it the ACA, or the
Right.
Affordable Health Care Act.
Okay, so, but anyway, that date isn't until like 2014 anyway, right? It's sometime in the federal fiscal budget, I think it's October 1 of 2014 that it actually would kick in, but all this stuff is supposed to happen before that to be in place, correct?
Yeah. And a lot of the goodies, a lot of the things that everybody who could complain about them because they just seem like something that everyone would want, those are coming in place soon.
Just like the not being able to deny for pre-existing conditions, or keeping my daughter, who turns 25 tomorrow, keeping her on until age 26, which you couldn't do before. So,
well, except in Wisconsin. So again, just to point out, and this is, you just brought me up a perfect segue. You're probably aware that in Wisconsin we had a law that said till age 27.
okay.
We had already been covering till 27. Obamacare comes in, and we're going to adopt and match this one-size-fits-all policy that they decreed from Washington, and we're going to go from 27 to 26. So you tell me if that's a good thing, because what that is you've got a lot of states where they haven't been covering nearly as many people. They haven't been as generous as we have been. And now we're going to match them in a one-size-fits-all system. Is that progress? I don't know.
You seem to be saying, because you kind of
we'd have been better off to
here
let the states could do it. Some of the things that really make sense, you're going to see just fade away, like the whole health savings account idea, where you have a high deductible plan matched with an individual account, and we did that at the City of Hudson. They've done it all around the area. Somerset Schools did it. Then the police found out about it. They wanted Somerset Police got it. We did.
Okay,
it
so if Wisconsin is doing it so much
away.
better than what anything that could come
Doesn't
through
mean,
on the
no,
Affordable
there's
Care
work
Act,
to be done.
why wouldn't we just opt out? Like a lot of states are just saying, we're just not going to do it. We're going to keep what we had going. Why not?
I think it's yet to be decided what will happen on that. We very well might decide to do that. There will be a health, unless the law is repealed, there will be a health exchange one way or another. It'll either be state run or it'll be federal run.
Right.
I believe in my reading of the law, and I spent a lot of time studying it, there really won't be much difference between a state-run exchange and a federal exchange, because every state-run exchange has got to be cookie-cutter identical to what the federal plan is. And so the people that think we'll make ours different, they're going to soon find out that it's going to be pretty much the Fed's way or the highway.
Even if what you're doing is better as a state? I mean, I always thought that all these federal mandates that it was you needed to be able to provide at least what they were doing. And in most cases, no matter what subject we're talking about, Wisconsin was doing it bigger and better already.
We were, yeah. But I mean, that's the rub, is that we've got a lot of people that have been relying on that now would be moving on to the exchanges, and I think people don't really realize that.
Okay.
There's an unintended consequence to that whole law, and the basic idea that someone be forced to buy health insurance, even if they're healthy and they choose not to, you're a lawyer, an attorney. I'm not. But I do not get the reasoning that they followed at the Supreme Court to come up with the justification to find it constitutional. And that would be a whole nother segment.
Exactly. But, again, we getting back to this is political season, election season, and certain states are already having their primaries and so forth for the fall. You don't have any primary opposition, I understand?
No.
Okay. So what do you see as
we've got to get our economy turned around. That's been the job. That's been what we've been talking about. I mean, all this about the budget just simply comes down to the approach that was taken before was to increase taxes, increase spending, and we've got to get things on a level, even keel so a business can feel comfortable moving to Wisconsin, expanding in Wisconsin, growing here, taking a risk. Business is about risk. Our capitalist system is about, here's opportunity, but there's risk involved. Am I willing to risk my capital on that opportunity? That's what it's about. And people have a choice. I mean, they could stay in a safe CD or some money market instrument, or they can actually plow it into buying a new piece of equipment or adding on to their factory or starting a new business or going off from their job to start the business that they always dreamed of having. But they got to risk their life savings in doing it. You don't make those kind of risk decisions when you're uncertain about what's going on, or you feel like there's a climate that's
So what
just
can
going
the
to
state do,
penalize it.
without talking about the feds, because then that's another subject that would take another hour, and we're getting close to the end of our hour
Yep.
here. So what do you see accomplishing in the next 2 years as far as why are you running for re-election to be able to get that economy
So
back on
that's
its
really
feet?
what it's all about. I mean, we've got to continue to improve our tax system, particularly our income tax system, that makes it incentivize people to build here, and there are still things that we can do. So our domestic production tax credit is one that we could talk about that, but we're going to phase out income tax on manufacturers. And I think we're going to see a huge increase in manufacturing over the next few years, people coming and growing in Wisconsin and bringing good jobs with them. So there's one. Our regulatory environment, we've got to continue to look at where we need regulations and where it's become excessive, and there's definitely some room for improvement.
Any examples?
For example, we've talked about mining. Mining was a big issue. I still think there's ways that we can have mining here in Wisconsin. Our neighbor Michigan does it. Our neighbor Minnesota does it. And we haven't had iron ore mining in Wisconsin now for a generation. We set a set of laws where, yes, you could follow those laws, but no one will. No one will invest here and mine iron here. And that's a huge industry, and we're sitting on the top of the same vein of iron ore that they are, our neighbors. I mean, in some cases it's happening just 50 or 100 miles away in the UP. There's no reason why we couldn't make some very realistic changes that would still protect the environment, but would allow investment in a whole new industry to flourish. And that's an example. We couldn't come together on that, but there was no reason we couldn't. It was a legislative failure, frankly, that we couldn't get together and make some modernization changes in that law. I still think we'll revisit it, because the iron's still there, and the demand for it is still out there. And those are lots and lots of good jobs that were just waiting. And that's not down in southeast Wisconsin. That's not too far from here. I mean, we've got people right here in Hudson that make mining equipment, and that would benefit by having more mining happening. So that's not some pie in the sky.
So regulation, phasing out manufacturing, income tax, what other things do you want to accomplish that might help get
I'm
this?
passionate about education. I have been. I mean, we talked about that. I still think there are a lot of things we can do to improve education, and we will. And here's the cool thing, that we've balanced our budget, and we are going to turn around our economy. I'm very optimistic that we're going to say, we're seeing it already. We've moved up on surveys of like CEOs and business surveys. We've moved up. That isn't just fluff. And those are the people that decide where they're going to invest and build and grow, and they feel much more positively about Wisconsin. So I think we're going to see an upswing in our economy. More jobs, more sales, means more revenues to the state. And now we could probably go and do something really big, like our state aid formula for schools, which everybody agrees they'd like to see tweaked, but you can't hardly do it in bad times. You've got to do that when times are better.
Right.
So we got to get to where times are better, and then start to take a look at some of the problems that people have talked about for 20 years and they never could tackle. We could tackle things like that.
Okay.
So,
well, with that, we need to call it a show, but really appreciate you coming on.
it's always fun to come.
Yeah, we could talk another hour, I'm sure. But, well, with the election coming up, I suppose you've got more doors to knock on.
Got to go knock on doors.
Are you done with the
make
parades?
Phone calls. No, we have Pepperfest coming up in, that's August 18th, Saturday morning, and you should all come out. Pepperfest is a great community festival.
And I think, yes,
it is.
A lot of fun. Yep. And as a North Hudson resident for 10 years, I heard it every time. I didn't live too far from the grounds. But when it comes to the election and voting, we've had changes in the voter identification, providing that. We've had already 3 elections, as I recall, going to the polls 3 times this year. We still got 2 more to go. But it's a new district size anyway. I mean, you're representing...
it's more compact.
Yes.
Where I used to have about half of Pierce County was in the 30th Assembly District. Now our 30th Assembly District is much more compact. We've got Hudson, River Falls, We've got the western third of St. Croix County, so it's Roberts, not quite to the edge of New Richmond, all of Holton, not quite up to Somerset. So it's pretty compact, about 15 to 20 miles square. And redistricting had a big impact in our area because of our massive growth. The third fastest growing district was the 29th Assembly, just to the eastern part of St. Croix County, and the fourth fastest in the state was the 30th. And between the two, they're the two fastest adjacent assembly districts in the state.
Sure.
So nowhere else is growing as fast as St. Croix County over the last 10 years. And so that made our lines, our districts get smaller.
Well, and when I ran in the mid-'90s, that was mid to late '90s, that was 2 censuses ago, and then we were about 60% bigger, I think.
Geographically.
Yes.
Right. So whereas when I was running in 2010, I was knocking on doors down in Hager City, and when you were running in the 90s, you were knocking on doors probably 20 miles further south from there.
Right.
And now that's come up
Elmwood
and up
and Plum City.
Exactly.
And,
So all of that is now in the 93rd Assembly District, and we've really got the population here now where it's Roberts, River Falls, Hudson, and sort of
the in-betweens, Holton.
St. Joe, Troy, Kinnickinnick, Town of Warren, part of Town of Richmond.
Well,
so
and
you got the Hudson School District and a pretty good chunk of the River Falls School District and part of St. Croix Central. But it's different. I spent a lot of time 2 summers ago getting to know people in Ellsworth and Prescott, and I won't represent them anymore. That's the downside to that.
Sure.
Senator Harsdorf has represented Ellsworth and Prescott for 20 of the last 22 years and doesn't represent them anymore.
Yeah, what a change.
That's a big change, but it's just a consequence of our growth.
And our proximity to the Twin Cities. But
we want to have clean, fair elections that everyone can count on. I think we do in Wisconsin. This fall, I'm sure we're going to have big turnouts, and I'm sure it'll run smoothly. We have great election officials. You can go, and it's not too late to volunteer and be trained to be an election official, and they're always looking for people that can come.
Great. Well, with that,
so go out there and vote.
There you go, and volunteer. A great opportunity to serve, and it is interesting to watch the electoral process, not necessarily as a participant.
Right.
But,
yeah.
And you're right. We do want to encourage folks to get out and vote because that's how democracy works. Thank you for your public service.
Thanks a lot.
And we will see you again, I'm sure, around the community. So. Take care, and please join us again for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal.